Okay, so welcome to part two. So the other problems with lobbying and lobbyists are financial donations to campaigns. And again, this can cause issues as well. Now, the thing to be clear about this is it's normally done by the lobbying companies and not the individual lobbyists. So just make that distinction clear. So it's the companies, so like Hickling and Co., okay, who employ the lobbyists who might do the donations, not like Joe Bloggs, the individual lobbyist. 20% of the campaign funds, for example, for Senator Matt Boukas, who was the former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, came from lobbyists and lobbying companies linked to pharma. Pharma represents the pharmaceutical industry, the drug industry. So again, it shows the influence which these big pressure groups and these big organisations can have over members of Congress due to the fact they have elections on a regular basis and therefore reliant upon money. In 2009, this same person prevented pressure groups who wanted a wider coverage of healthcare to take part in discussions. Was there a link? Because clearly pharma, want to control the drug market, want to make sure the prices remain quite high. It was in their interest to prevent kind of a wider coverage of healthcare, which might affect their profit margins. He claims that there was no link between it, but you do have to wonder. Right, there's been a number of scandals involving lobbying and lobbyists and lobbying organisations. The first one, or one of them, was in November 2005. The congressman for California's 50th district had to resign after he received $2.6 million in gifts from a defence contractor. He was also a member of the committee in Congress that dealt with defence. So there's clearly been some skullduggery going on there. And this really famous case was in January 2006 when Jack Abramoff was convicted of defrauding some of his clients. So he ran some lobbying company, but he'd been defrauding some of those pressure groups who'd sought him to lobby for them. He'd used expensive meals, golfing trips to Scotland to build relationships with politicians. He kind of used the money he was getting from these pressure groups and kind of squandered it on these luxuries for himself. Now, there has been some attempts to regulate lobbying and lobbyists to try and bring it all under some order, but it's quite a difficult task, and one of the main reasons is due to the Constitution itself, which means any kind of strong attempt to deal with lobbying and lobbyists is going to meet up against the Supreme Court. And again, it's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law, the First Amendment says, abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of peaceful people to peacefully assemble, and then the crucial bit for pressure groups and lobbying companies, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So this makes it difficult for laws to regulate lobbying to stick because it comes up against the Constitution and therefore the Supreme Court. That said, there have been some laws passed. 1946, the Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act said that lobbyists need to be registered and all financial transactions to be disclosed. So they have to, if you want to be a lobbyist, you have to join a list, basically, to say that you're a registered lobbyist. The Supreme Court took issue with part of this and said it was only applicable to lobbyists who spent more than half their time with members of Congress. How they measured 50% of your time being spent with members of Congress is another issue altogether, hence why it essentially gutted this particular law. That the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995, which said that lobbying extended to all forms of lobbying. There's a 12-month delay, they said, before a member of Congress or an ex-member of Congress could join a lobbying company to try and create some kind of cool down, if you like, in that relationship. So, he or she might not be quite so matey with those members of Congress. Although, to be fair, if you've been a member of Congress, you may have left office. That doesn't mean you're never going to speak to your former colleagues again, does it? And in 2007, following the Jack Abramoff affair and the other one in California, this law was passed, the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act. And again, rather than having a 12-month gap between leaving Congress and becoming a lobbyist, it made it a 2-year gap. And I think the idea is that obviously in 2 years is the length of time between elections, and therefore there may be a significant number of people in the new Congress who may not be have been there when you were in Congress itself. There's some doubt about that, though, isn't there, when you think about how many of them get re-elected. Members of Congress were banned from accepting gifts and meals from lobbyists. Lobbyists have to disclose their filings, i.e. their financial transactions, every quarter instead of every year. And former members of Congress lost their access to the private parts of Congress, like the congressional gym, for example. So before this date, you could leave Congress, but you could still actually go into Congress and go to the private gym and access those private areas where obviously the chances are you'll probably bump into your former mates and stuff and then have a chat to them about, do some informal lobbying. Well, they try to make it harder. And heavier penalties. Okay, if you willfully violate these laws, again, there's a phrase there, what do you mean by willfully? $200,000 fine and up to 5 years imprisonment. So that is where we're up to regarding lobbying and lobbyists. And some of these issues are common in the UK as well. The revolving door syndrome, for example, occurs in the UK. And again, there's been issues and concerns around that here, as there has also been in the United States. Out of interest, I also had a quick look. Apparently, Donald Trump passed an executive order saying that members of his administration could not join lobbying companies for 5 years after they leave the White House. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. So that's the information there about lobbying and lobbying companies.